Hey, folks. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from to this new episode of the Rise Up Radio. And in this episode, I have with me Jimmy Parker. Jimmy, very, very warm welcome to you on the Rise Up
Mm,
Radio.
thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So, folks, a quick introduction about myself. So, I'm the founder and CEO of Risely, and we're helping organizations to reimagine learning. And that's exactly what we're going to be discussing with Jimmy today, who's basically leading Peaq as a chief transformation officer, and with its proprietary approach to developing leaders, which is specifically built on micro experiences. Jimmy, I'm really excited about learning more about experiences. But before that, folks. Jimmy also brings more than 2 decades of experience in the HR and org transformation space. And he has held leadership roles at organizations such as Kaiser Permanente and Home Depot. So, Jimmy, this is some very rich experience. Why don't you take us through your journey a little bit?
My journey. Oh, okay, sure. Let's see. I actually started in the military. I was a Marine Corps officer,
Wow,
where I really got the leadership bug. They treat leadership very seriously there, and I had lots
very,
of traits worth emulating. And it's a great place for anybody who's devoted to leadership to really grow up. Ended up
yeah,
flying attack helicopters, so that really sort of imbued in me a sense of like stuff's got to work. Something
yeah,
has to be effective, and we'll probably get into that in our conversation today around L&D. Has to work. It has to be effective,
correct.
to make it a thing. So, but that's where I
Yeah.
picked that up, I think, from the military.
Hmm.
Started writing code in the fifth grade. My first love was computers, and was did I had a mini career in leading software teams. But that leadership bug just came back large and in charge, and I really wanted to develop leaders. That was really my passion, and that took me
Yeah.
into the path that I'm in today. For all kinds of things, from running classroom training all the way through to org transformation consulting, executive coaching, org design work, you name it. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, awesome. Well, this is going to be a very rich conversation, Jimmy. So why don't we, dive into it straight away?
Right?
Typically, when we talk of learning and leadership development, right, it has always faced a trade-off, which is you can either be highly effective or you can scale. And when you try to scale, that's where things start to spiral down in terms of effectiveness, in terms of what learners are getting and what organization is getting out of that learning.
Mm.
What has been your experience, throughout your, not only your career as a professional, but also your L&D career later on?
Mm. Yeah, that trade-off really bothered me, because there are programs that are extremely effective, life-changing for
Hmm.
people who go
Hmm.
through them. And,
Hmm.
they look back on their careers as that being a really pivotal moment for them. But those programs are also very expensive.
Hmm.
And so only executives get them, or high
Correct.
potential, but it's less than 5% of your leadership population in any given
Correct.
organization. That really bothered me,
Hmm.
that the only people who could get really high quality development were those rare few who could afford it.
Hmm.
And so I've really been about democratizing development, trying to
Hmm.
do what I call deep development, meaningful development, impactful development at
Hmm.
scale for all people. And
Hmm.
whenever you try to touch a lot of people, you're right, effectiveness drops off the table.
Yeah.
And that's the trade-off. I've been really working hard most of my career to try to figure out how to break that trade-off and do both at the same time.
So how did you realize, or when did that realization happen that, something's got to change? Tell us
Mm.
through that experience that you went through, either personally yourself or you saw in your organization that, whatever programs that you were running were not producing the right results that you were expecting them to.
Yeah. So when I made the switch out of IT into like an HR leadership trainer role, I was excited because this was my dream. I'd been after it for a long time. My first job
Yeah.
really in HR, and I was running lots of leaders through the classroom, and people loved my stuff. I got great marks, and it was in a smaller company where, I got to know a lot of the people, almost all the
Hmm.
leaders, and they'd call me every once in a while. They say, Jimmy, I've got this issue with one of my direct reports.
Yeah.
And so we have a conversation. I go to their office. This is pre-COVID, and when everything was in the office. And they'd say, how do I deal with this situation? And I'd give them my advice, and I'd start with, you see that participant guide right there on your
Yeah.
bookshelf behind you, the workshop I taught you, 18 months ago. Let's grab that and let's revisit, what we
Let's
talked
revisit it.
about.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it didn't take very many of those instances to realize
Conversations. Yeah.
that leaders really aren't built in the classroom,
Mm,
unfortunately.
mm.
Um, and that was sort of the aha moment where I'm like, well, if traditional training doesn't really change leadership behavior, traditional training is
Yeah.
good for lots of things, but
Right.
leadership is a really complex skill. And so traditional
Right.
training tends not to be very effective for actually driving on the
Yeah.
job behavior change. And then I started scratching my head, like, what drives behavior change? And that's
Mm,
what really took my studies and my research and my experimentation into areas that tended to fall outside of traditional L&D offerings.
mm,
And
mm.
that's what I've been experimenting with for about 17 or so years now.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. And when you look back, what patterns do you see typically that you tried but didn't work, in the traditional mode, typically?
In the traditional mode, yeah.
Yeah.
So uh, there's sort of one deeply rooted assumption in L&D that really guides all of what L&D does, or almost all
Hmm.
of what
Hmm.
L&D does. And it's this assumption that if leaders knew different, they would do different.
Hmm.
And
Which
that's
is not
not a
true.
true assumption. That's not a
Which
true
is not
assumption,
true.
right? A lot of
Yeah.
people know how to be more fit than they are,
Yeah.
and they
Not
want to.
necessarily that they actually act to be fit.
Yeah, and they want to be, but there's other gaps in the way than just a knowledge gap, right?
Hmm.
And so most of L&D is focused on plugging knowledge gaps. An instructional designer, what
Hmm.
do they design? They design
Yeah.
instruction. They start with what knowledge does this person need, and how
Correct.
can I give it to them efficiently and
Correct.
effectively? And then we hope that they apply that knowledge on the job to
Yeah.
actually solve
Yeah.
problems or drive business results or whatever. And it really is a hope in most of L&D because it's just that translation from learning something new to actually applying it on the job
Hmm.
efficiently and competently is less than 10%. It's the
Yeah.
traditional learning transfer problem, the forgetting curve. It goes under many
Hmm.
names. It's a real
Yeah.
problem pervasive in L&D, and it's why many L&D people often just measure level one satisfaction, maybe level two retention, but
Correct.
never really measuring very widespread level three behavior change and beyond
Correct.
into business
Correct.
impacts. Yeah.
So what stops for that translation, right? What doesn't translate from learning to behavior as per you?
What doesn't translate? Well, think about gaps to behavior change, barriers to
Hmm.
behavior change, right?
Hmm.
Knowledge gap is one legitimate, it can be a legitimate gap.
Correct.
Like a brand new leader, if they've never been taught how to say delegate effectively, like giving them that knowledge, giving them a simple framework, maybe a template that can really drive
Helps.
behavior in a
Yeah.
useful,
Yeah.
efficient, meaningful, effective way.
Correct.
So that's one of the exceptions where if the leader knew different, they would do different.
Hmm.
But outside of some of those simple cases, there's other barriers to behavior change than just knowledge gaps.
Hmm.
One might be a habit, what you could call a habit gap,
Hmm. Hmm.
whereas they know what they need to do, but it requires them to build new on-the-job habits so they show up differently naturally without having to think
Yeah.
about that. So that requires the L&D professional to understand the fundamentals of habit change and how to
Correct.
accelerate habit formation. And most instructional designers and L&D people have never really studied that unless they've done it on their own. Read up on
Hmm.
James Clear's
Hmm.
habits, books,
Hmm. Hmm.
or other people sort of in that space. And so that's
Hmm.
one sort of industry that's very mature. It's been
Hmm.
around for a long, long time, but L&D
Hmm.
tends not to leverage that wisdom in designing their solutions. But there can be other gaps too, not just
Hmm.
knowledge gaps and habit gaps. There's about a half
Hmm.
dozen. Some of them are
Yeah.
systemic and operational that L&D has no
All right.
ability to influence, but
Yeah.
they generally have a lot more ability to influence than they would recognize.
Yeah. And typically, when you see L&D programs, right? So learning leaders typically try to see how can we get the most out of our buck, right? And they try to spend it as much as possible on creating scale. And that has been the typical conflict between how can we reach more people instead of how can we translate that into behaviors. So is it purely like an economic question, or is it something
Hmm.
deeper?
Well, I think I could take this in a couple different ways. Uh, yeah. Do you want to focus just on the economics, the sort of money piece of it, or maybe why things aren't as effective?
I think we've already touched upon why things aren't as effective, right? Maybe it's a
Sure.
design problem. Maybe we're not even looking at it. But is it only, does everything boil down to economics, or is there a deeper issue behind the design of those
Hmm.
programs, or how do you
Uh,
connect those programs with the company's objectives or the behaviors that you're
okay.
trying to achieve for at the end
Okay.
of the day? Because if that
Yeah,
link is missing, then everything is missing, isn't it?
I got you. Well, let me see if this helps answer the question. You go back to that fundamental assumption. If leaders knew different, they would do different, which
Hmm.
I question is really true. Okay. But if we
Yeah.
have that, we're holding that as fundamentally true. Then what that means is every L&D solution requires new content to be designed, developed, and delivered to
Hmm.
learners,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And content is expensive.
Yeah.
Designing content is expensive. Developing
Yeah.
content is expensive. Acquiring content from like a content provider like Harvard Managed Mentor or one of these other solutions out there that they've built a bunch of stuff and for companies to purchase, they charge a pretty penny for it. It's very, very
Yeah.
expensive. Um, and so the model of learning first and then doing, that's the source, I think, of a
Hmm.
lot of why things tend to be pretty expensive and not very scalable. So
Hmm.
learning to do is the primary model in L&D.
Hmm.
Um, the 70-20-10, most people know is the 70 represents, most leaders learn most from experiential learning on the job, not
Hmm.
learning to do, learning from doing
Hmm.
doing first. And so
Hmm.
instead of leading with learning, leading with content that has to be designed, developed, delivered, very expensive. If you
Hmm.
lead with doing, that's the experiential part, and then bake
Right.
that in, bake processes in that helps them to learn from that application, from that on the job, from that
Yeah.
experience. You can develop people in much more cost effective ways because there's no content to
Hmm.
be designed, developed, delivered. And so that's what actually breaks that trade-off. And you can then offer high quality experiential development at scale to
Hmm.
everyone, not just
Hmm.
executives and high potentials. Does that
Hmm.
answer your question, Ashish, or would you like to
It
sort of?
does.
Okay.
It does. I think one thing that I would like to add, Jimmy, is a lot of times the context of that individual is missing as well in learning, which is, what's in it for me? Why should I go through this training program?
Mm,
In the end, is it solving my issue as an individual or making me do my job better or not? And a lot of times when the program is the same for everyone, they lose interest because at the end of the day, you're getting the same content, I'm getting the same content. There is no connection to my contextualization or personalization. And at the end of the day, why should I even bother spending 2 hours of my time going through
mm,
this training program or even more than that? And it ties down to very clearly to what you were saying earlier, which is when you're trying to go for scale, these challenges become very, very evident and they don't translate
yeah.
into the right behavior because at the end of the day, I'm consuming content which is very expensive, but it's not translating into the right behavior.
Yeah. So there is a need to customize and allow people to sort of tailor their
Hmm.
developmental journey so that it aligns more directly with their own objectives, their own desires, right?
Right.
And most everybody wants to perform better on the job.
Yeah.
And if most
Clearly.
traditional approaches to leader development don't translate into performance
Yeah.
improvement, there's a huge
Yeah.
miss already there
There's
just
a
from
huge miss. Yeah.
just from
Right.
that. But
Correct.
again, that's the trick. And when we talk about experiential development,
Yeah.
most people think ropes courses, they think of going off into the forest, they think of
Right.
metaphorical learning where we're rowing a boat together and learning leadership principles or something like that. And that's experiential learning, and it can be very
Yeah.
good and powerful, but it's also very
Yeah.
expensive. I'm
Yeah.
talking about
It is.
experiential learning in the flow of work, experiential learning at work. And that's a
Yeah.
new approach that most of L&D hasn't done.
Yeah.
That is what I've been experimenting with for a while.
So let's talk about that. I think you've developed
Okay.
something called micro experiences, right? That
Mm,
breaks that trade-off that we've been discussing. So why don't we dive into it? And can you tell us what
sure.
micro experiences are and what is the core principle behind it?
Okay. Yeah. The the core principle behind it is I sort of touched on it in a minute, earlier. Most of L&D functions on a model where it's learning to do. I teach you
Hmm.
some stuff, I give you some content, knowledge
Yeah.
transfer takes place, and then we hope that you apply it on the job. Okay.
Yeah.
Learning to do. But if you flip that model
Hmm.
and you don't lead with learning, you lead
Hmm.
with doing.
Hmm.
And the doing is some sort of on the job. It's got to take place on the job, not in a
Correct.
simulated classroom environment, but on the job. And then through reflection questions and discussion, you extract more wisdom and learning out of that doing. That's the fundamental difference in micro experiences, my approach,
Hmm.
and most other approaches there. Um,
Hmm.
because we know
So,
that just having an
hmm.
experience is not enough. People don't learn from
Yeah.
having an experience.
Correct.
John
Correct.
said this 100 years ago. People learn from
Yeah.
reflecting that
Correct.
experience.
Correct.
So you got to
Correct.
have the experience and you got to reflect on it. I can share some examples if you'd like. I've got some
Yeah, I
slides.
think that would be lovely. That's my next question. So, would you like to share some examples and walk us
Yeah,
through maybe how would it look like from a participant's perspective and what a micro experience is?
great. I love to do a little show and tell. I've got some slides that can help
Why
with
not?
this. Would that
Why
be
not?
okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Let me get my sharing button here. Let me find that. Share. Get that turned on here. Looks like I need you to.
Yes. There you go.
There. All right. Perfect. All right. So I call it micro experiences because that name has really what's I've just described as fundamental, sort of baked into it. Micro means something that someone can do, an employee can do, a leader can do on the job in 45 minutes or less. You see 0 minutes. I'll show you an example of a 0 minute micro experience in just a second. And then the experience is what I already mentioned. It's got to be something that is on the job. It's real work. Think of it as the kind of things that great leaders do, but most
Hmm.
leaders don't.
Yeah.
Again, on the job, real work. And so it's not micro learning. Micro
Hmm.
experiences is very different from micro learning. Micro learning leads
Hmm.
with learning, leads with content, and
Hmm.
then hopes we
Hmm.
apply it. This
Hmm.
leads with action. This leads with doing, and it's
Hmm.
not done in a classroom. I've had people
Hmm.
hear about this and say, "Oh, we're going to augment all of our ILT training with micro experience." I'm like, no, no, you've missed the point. All right, so here's an example to build emotional intelligence or active listening skills. Imagine giving a task or an action like this to all leaders in your company.
Hmm.
You know, think of the next meeting, identify the next meeting on your calendar that has at least 5 people in it.
Hmm.
And then all I want you to do during that meeting is to think about what each of the other people in that meeting are probably thinking and feeling, but not actually saying.
Hmm.
Then take a few notes and
Hmm.
try to get as an accurate picture as possible.
Hmm.
This an example of a 0 minute micro experience because it doesn't require any more time on the leader's calendar to do. It's already
Correct.
they're leveraging an
Correct.
existing. And also, for some, this is not a very challenging micro experience at all. Some
Hmm.
grew up in a highly emotional, intelligent family,
It
and
comes naturally to them. Yeah.
this is the kind of thing that they've been doing every day of their life, every meeting for
Yeah.
years, and it's
Yeah.
habitualized. And so this is not difficult for them. And so
Hmm.
you begin to see there's a design challenge of
Hmm.
dialing up or down the
Hmm.
difficulty based on where someone's growth edge is, or what gets them out of their comfort zone, or what's
Yeah.
appropriately challenging for them to
Yeah.
actually drive people development. Okay. So this is an example for maybe earlier career leaders, first time leaders, that type of thing can be very effective there.
Yeah.
Although I think we all know executives where this might be
Correct.
challenging too. Here's another example, optimized more for maybe, say, VP level.
Hmm.
In an organization that wants to be more disruptive, and they need
Hmm.
to they got all their executives have grown up there, they've been thinking the way that company thinks and operates, and they
Hmm.
want to shake up and break up thinking and be more disruptive in their industry. And so they need to get their leaders implementing more strategic thinking habits and applying them on
Hmm.
the job to
Hmm.
drive new forms of value. And in this
Yeah.
case, we're taking the content and tools that they might receive through traditional training in like an executive MBA program,
Hmm.
And all we're doing here is we're asking them, we're chunking it down into the micro-sized 45 minutes or less. And we're saying,
Yep.
hey, if we're to actually apply what you learned in that executive MBA program, what would that look like? And here's a
Great.
piece of that. Identify your top three value drivers for your primary Gen Z customers here. Now we're looking at a
Hmm.
target set, customer
Hmm.
segment, and then do a little bit of a competitive analysis on how your
Hmm.
company stacked up against those
Hmm.
value drivers, to a competitive you're choosing. This is forcing them to think in more innovative, strategic, value creation kind of ways. And
Yeah.
again, not appropriate for a first-time leader, right? This is
Great.
more for high potentials or people maybe
Yeah.
VP pipeline and
Yeah.
beyond. But you're also getting at how if there's a strategic initiative, a corporate initiative at the CEO level, not the CHRO level,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
CEO, COO level, we need to be more agile. We need to be more nimble. We need to be more
Hmm.
innovative. We need to be more disruptive in the marketplace. Those are things that matter outside of
Great.
HR.
Great.
And here's an example of how a micro experience can accelerate
Yeah.
corporate strategy, business strategy, not just HR strategy. And
Yeah.
that's that key here to really driving org transformation.
I think that's the key to org transformation, right? And I really like the action orientation rather than learning orientation, the way you have put it, Jimmy. But how do you operationalize this in a mid to large organization? Let's say you have 2,000 people, right? And how do you scale it? I think that's the next question I have.
That's the next question most people have, and that's why that's the next slide. And so if you think about one of those examples I just shared with you,
Hmm.
that would be operationalized through this cycle here, which is
Okay.
quite simple. But basically, people in a micro experience program would receive that micro experience. Everybody gets the same one at the beginning of, say,
Hmm.
a regular work week. And then
Hmm.
first thing they would do is they would adapt it. This gets to the
Hmm.
customization problem that most people are trying to solve through AI. Here, it's like,
Hmm.
hey, if this micro experience isn't appropriately challenging for me or doesn't support my learning objectives, I encourage people to adapt it in such a way that will support their learning objectives, their
Hmm.
developmental objectives, their strengths and weaknesses, the type of team they have, maybe the
Hmm.
type of industry that they're in. Feel free to adapt it. Stay true to the spirit and the intent. That allows people, it engages them more, and it allows people to shape their developmental journey,
Yeah.
more in alignment with their own objectives. The second
Yeah.
piece is to actually do it, complete it, knock it out. It's an action. You can track it. Have you done it or haven't you? That can be tracked. Of course, we use or technology platforms to manage this at large scale so that we can know whether Jimmy did his
Hmm.
stuff for week 7 or not.
Correct.
Um, and each one of these micro experiences also has a reflection question. I didn't give you an example of that, but each one has a
Hmm.
question designed to drive deeper reflection after they complete the action itself.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's what helps drives more individual learning. Those first 3 steps are experiential development for
Yeah.
you to
Yeah.
learn more from your own real world experience. But then when we can get 5 or 6 people who just did this on their
Hmm.
own in a group, 1 hour meeting, and I have a way of facilitating this discussion. What we find, Ashish, is that what you would learn from the exact same micro experience is different from what I would learn from that
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
3 or 4 other people. And so when we get people together, I hear what you learned, not just what
Yeah.
I learned. And you hear what I learned, and you get 4 or 5 perspectives in there. And that discussion becomes an accelerant to
Hmm.
everyone's learning. And that's 1 week of a program. One micro
Yeah.
experience equals 1 week. And then you just repeat that the next week with a different micro experience. And that's how they get operationalized. Um, Basically, a micro experience is 1 week. So 12 micro experiences would be 12 weeks or roughly three
Hmm.
months. And you can pick
Hmm.
some good meaty topics. There's some examples here on the types of topics I've built for clients, sort of in the past. And each
Hmm.
week, each one of those dots is going through that cycle in a given
Yeah.
week and repeating. So you build out the program, you recruit people that want to be in a program like this,
Hmm.
and then you basically kick it off. And what I didn't mention is those small group meetings are run by what I call a coach. You could call them a facilitator or
Okay.
a team leader or something like that. That's usually
Hmm.
one job level higher,
Hmm.
and that's a key part of the model itself, what I call coaches. And
Yeah.
so do a little bit of coach prep, you do your kickoff, and at that point, this program is really run by the coaches, not by HR.
Hmm. Hmm.
HR's job is to support those coaches in running the program.
Right.
And
Right.
that's another reason why I've had as many as 30,000 leaders in a micro experience program at one time, and that can be
Hmm.
run with a L&D staff of just over one person. That's a
Right.
crazy. If you think about the
Yeah, because
scalability.
you're leveraging a lot of the organizational bandwidth already, right? Because managers are themselves the coaches and they should be developing their team members accordingly. But
But before I go any longer, you asked about how it's operationalized. Did that
yeah,
answer? Yeah. Okay. Good.
yeah, it does. But tell me, so does is there some kind of an organizational readiness that needs to be in place for this to work? Or you think any organization can deploy it?
Well, I have run into clients where their talent management systems just weren't really very mature. They were really just getting started. They didn't have much of an
Hmm.
L&D staff. They're pretty small, right? And I would say, just from a logistical standpoint, they don't quite have the enough
Hmm.
infrastructure yet. They're not running any
Yeah.
developmental programs at all. And there is a sense in which, especially for early career leaders and for like safety compliance training, like those are gotta have. So you got to have some of
Yeah.
that basic
Yeah. Yeah.
compliance stuff, safety stuff, and even frontline manager stuff, which is usually e-learning or
Hmm.
ILT. Um, you got to have some level of maturity for this to actually make sense to add onto it. But
Hmm.
let me show
Hmm.
you another slide here. So
Hmm.
this is a typical performance curve where,
Hmm.
at the left, you've got not very many people. It might be new enroll, and that's just
Yeah.
code for not yet competent.
Yeah.
You've got the middle majority here of people who are competent, and, in their role. They do a great
Hmm.
job for your
Hmm.
company. They show up every day. And they're solid performers. Every organization is built on this middle majority to
Right.
deliver every day. And then you have a relative few people who are really high performers, high potentials,
Hmm.
out on the
Hmm.
right here. The insight here is that traditional training that we've talked about as not being very effective, it's not effective everywhere. It is effective
Yeah.
and efficient at moving people from the left half of this bell curve into the middle majority.
Middle
That's why we
majority.
do
Yeah.
a lot. And so, and that only works when you really have knowledge gaps that if you plug those knowledge gaps, it'll translate into competence
Right.
and behavior,
Right.
right? And that's for leadership development. That's most true for very first time leaders.
Hmm.
And so that can be most effective. And so if you asked me to build a micro experience program for a bunch of people who are just promoted into their leadership role for the first time in their career, I would
Probably
say no.
won't work. Yep.
I would say it's not going to be as effective as
Correct.
traditional training. But for everybody else who's been in role a while or been a
Hmm.
leader a while,
Hmm.
really what you want is not learning to do. You want learning from doing. You want experiential
Right.
development. And that micro experience really shines to drive high levels of performance, shifting that performance
Hmm.
curve to the right for everybody who goes through it. And we have
Hmm.
about a 90% success rate of getting people going through a micro experience program, exhibiting the on the job behaviors and habits that the program was designed to instill in
Yep.
people.
Yep. Very, very interesting. So let's talk a little bit about technology, Jimmy, right? Looking at where L&D is heading and especially with AI and personalization, I think micro experiences, how does it fit into the approach? And how does it complement the overall transition that's happening on the personalization and the AI front?
Yeah, I'll start sharing my slides here. I think
Hmm.
with AI, I've been around long enough to when word processors came online. They used to use typewriters,
I
right?
know.
And then everything started to get digitized, and then there was digital versions of files and folders, and it was
Yeah.
just replicating the physical
Floppy
world, right?
disks.
A lot of that's happening today with AI because
Right.
again, if the fundamental assumption is if leaders knew different, they would do different.
Yeah.
I'm using AI to just execute those same fundamental assumptions.
Hmm.
And personalization is how that tends to be showing up. But the
Hmm.
fundamental, solution is knowledge transfer of some kind.
Hmm.
I have to give you
Hmm.
content, design, develop,
Yeah.
deliver content. AI is going to help me
Yeah.
diagnose what content you need so that I
Correct.
can feed you in a very personalized, customized way.
Correct. Correct.
And again, when knowledge gap is the main gap to behavior change, that's a superb approach.
Right.
I
Right.
I don't I don't mean to say that it's not effective. It is effective for
Right.
certain situations, you know. But most of L&D is applying AI in that way to
Hmm.
figure out how to create. There's some experiential learning that's taking place with AI where you have live, real-time, like role play type stuff.
Hmm.
Also
Hmm.
can be very,
Hmm.
very impactful and effective.
Hmm.
It can drive huge insights and say, "Hey, let's have a leader navigate a difficult conversation," and the AI is now acting as that
Hmm.
uh, poor performer, let's say, or something like that.
Yep.
Um, and there's a very big difference between having an insight and
Hmm.
making productive use of that insight on the job and driving new
Correct.
habits around how they actually
Correct.
handle difficult conversations going forward. And so,
Correct.
even with that implementation of AI, I still see there's a knowledge transfer problem on the job, you know, kind of thing. For micro experiences, I've got about 13 different use cases on how AI can augment a micro experience program to make the
Hmm.
experience even richer and better
Yep.
for people.
Yep.
Everything through allowing the coach to be more effective on the job to giving participants real-time feedback, even in that discussion meeting itself, on sort of how
Hmm.
they're showing up and
Hmm.
whether they are in a growth mindset, let's say, or not, and
Right.
how they
Right.
show up at the next meeting a little bit in a different sort of
Hmm.
mindset kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, even giving people scenarios where they might say, "Hey, I'm having a difficult time with this one solution," and then having the AI tool feed up a micro experience designed
Right. Right.
to help
Specifically for
them
that situation. Yep.
solve that
Absolutely.
problem
Yep.
and develop their own skill as a
Yep.
leader, you know, sort of
Yep.
going forward with a reflection question and some coaching, you know, that type of a thing.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
very exciting frontiers around how AI is going to make all this better. I think my biggest criticism is don't
Hmm.
just use it to feed people
Yep.
more knowledge when that's
Couldn't
not going
agree
to be.
more. Couldn't agree more. Yeah. So, Jimmy, one last question from me to you, right? What's the one piece of advice that you would give to somebody, let's say an L&D leader trying to break
Mm,
the effectiveness versus scale trade-off in their organization?
yeah, you know, I'd say experiment with experiential learning. Most people, when they hear that phrase, again, they think of
Yeah.
very expensive endeavors like
Hmm.
going out of the office or off sites or, like I said, ropes courses or something like that. What I'm talking about here, as you can see, is experimenting
It's
with
more on the
experience
job. Yeah.
on the job,
On
you
the
know,
job.
within
Yeah.
the normal flow of work. You know, even that term, learning in the flow of work, that's becoming a popular term these days.
Yeah.
LIFOW is an acronym. Start to see
Right.
more and more. But again, look, notice the L. It's
It's
leading with
still learning.
learning. It's
Yeah,
still leading,
absolutely.
right? And so it's basically micro learning in the
Yeah.
flow of work, assuming that knowledge transfer is going to be the solution.
Yep.
So those are all good, worthy endeavors. I would say also experiment with true
Right.
experiential, the true 70 of 70-20-10. Figure out how you can get more leaders doing more on the job and learning from that doing,
Yep.
and figure out how you can begin to operationalize it. I have tons of lessons learned. If we had more time, I've got a slide where it builds out about 6 or 7 lessons learned from other clients
Hmm.
who've really tried to do this at scale, but maybe that'll be for another time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, Jimmy. It was really wonderful having you with us today. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as we
Yeah,
did,
of
and our audience is
course.
going to be.
Absolutely. I appreciate the invitation, Ashish, as always, and really enjoyed the conversation.
Loved it. All right. So there you have it, folks. Well, I hope after this conversation, more and more organizations are going to experience or experiment with experiential learning. And well, do experience it and do experiment with it and reach out to us and tell us how it went. Jimmy's contact is going to be available. Please feel free to reach out to him. And I'll see you with the new episode of the Rise Up Radio with a new guest. Till then, you folks take care and be safe. Bye bye.